Om. Om. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunattu Sah Viryam Karavavahe Tejasvinavaditamastu ma Vidvishavahe. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Namaskar, Sri Guru Murthy Ji, Professor Arvind Sharma, dear friends. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to today's Vimarsh talk by Professor Arvind Sharma on the Indic religious tradition and outline. Some of you have attended his previous discussions. As you know, he has given 4 talks already this year, and this is the last and the 5th in series on this tradition, on this topic of Indic religious traditions, in which he has covered a wide variety of subjects, aspects. To those who may not have known him, Professor Sharma is the Burks Professor of Comparative Religion in the School of Religious Studies at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And he has also taught in United States, Northeastern Boston, Temple, Harvard, and also in Australia, Queensland, Sydney, and also in India, Nalanda University. He has published extensively in the fields of Indian religions and comparative religion. He is the general editor of the Encyclopedia of Indian Religions, and his book on the Manusmriti is currently awaiting publication. He was instrumental in the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the world's religions at a global conference held in Montreal in 2016. Last year, Professor Sharma gave a series of talks on the theme of Hindutva, which is, I understand, is now coming as a book. So we are very thankful to Professor Sharma for taking up this theme of Indic religions and educating us on the Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. These are the 4 religions that he has covered in various aspects. And today's talk will also be on the religious traditions of these Indic religions. We are also very grateful to Guru Murthy Ji for his participation in today's talk. He has come specially to be present today, and he will be commenting on Professor Sharma's talk, and he's come all the way from Chennai, and that shows the kind of interest that he takes in matters related to Indian civilization and Indian religion, particularly Hinduism. Guru Murthy Ji, as you know, is the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Vivekananda International Foundation. He is a thought leader, although he is by profession a chartered accountant. But I think we know him more as a thought leader and who has spoken, written about Indian civilization, Indian religions, Indian values, and also, of course, on geopolitics, on economy and social issues, etc. He's also the editor of the prominent Tamil weekly Tughlaq. His lectures and writings on India's civilization, India's place in the world, have made a deep impression on all of us. And I think they're very original and very unique. So very happy to have him today at this discussion. In previous talks, Professor Sharma has covered a variety of subjects like the Indic religious traditions and the philosophical tradition of India, Varna, Ashram, and the relationship between Hinduism and Buddhism. So I think these things will continue, and he'll conclude his series of lectures with today's Vimarsh. So once again, thank you very much for joining us. And now I request Professor Arvind Sharma to make his remarks. Then I'll request Guru Murthy ji to comment, and then we'll have a discussion and some comments from the floor. Professor Sharma.
Shri Guru Murthy ji, Shri Arvind Gupta ji, and friends. As usual, I'll begin by offering a few remarks in Sanskrit, and then in Hindi, and then deliver the bulk of the lecture in English. Paramparagamaad Agamanu Sashtrad Vidyate Darshanamidam. Parampara Prasiddham Dharma Darshanam Dharma Visheshameva Vishayikaru. Tulnatmakaadhyanastu Nana Dhamma Samudayastu Leti Sadisha Dishataya Tulaneyacha Sarvadharma Sangram Vishayikaruti Darshanikalujanasya. Evam Tulana Purassaram Dharma Vishayakam Darshanam Tulnatmaka Darshanamiti Pratipattavya. Yatha Rajaniti Darshanam Kala Darshanam Naika Parampara Sangeeta Vishayam Tathaiva Darshanam Api Navinam. विश्वतो से वृत्ति स्वतंत्र प्रज्ञात्मिकाच प्रवृत्ति. तो सारांश ये कि हम लोग एक परंपरा का अध्ययन कर सकते या अनेक परंपराओं का तुलनात्मक अध्ययन कर सकते हैं. तो आज के विषय में मैं भारत की 4 परंपराओं को एक साथ लेकर चलूंगा. हिंदू धर्म, बुद्ध वचन, जैन शासन और सिक्खी. इसमें यह कल्पना सहायक होगी कि कोई हिंदू विद्वान 19वीं शताब्दी के आरंभ में भारत के जो धर्म हैं उनका निरीक्षण कर रहा हो, जब अंग्रेजों के पैर अभी जमे नहीं थे लेकिन जम रहे थे भारत में. तो परिकल्पना यह है कि वो विद्वान भारत के धर्मों का किस प्रकार से विवरण देगा. इस कल्पना को लेकर हम आगे चल रहे हैं. क्या वो भारतीय धर्मों को हिंदुइज्म, बुद्धिज्म, जैनिज्म, सिखिज्म इस विभाग का आश्रय लेकर चलेगा, या वैष्णव मत, शैव मत, तंत्र, पंथ इत्यादि शीर्षकों का प्रयोग करेगा. तो इसी कल्पना को लेकर अब मैं जो शेष मुझे कहना है वो अंग्रेजी में कहूँगा. I would like to begin by making some preliminary remarks. And these are 3. The first is that this presentation represents work in progress. In other words, I am still thinking my way through the various items I would be discussing. I shall therefore be grateful for any suggestions and feedback members of the audience might be willing to offer. The second is the following. As mentioned earlier, one is trying to present a picture of the Indic religious tradition the way an indigenous scholar is likely to have represented it around the beginning of the 19th century. It is quite possible that when we do so, that scholar, or rather when doing so, that scholar would have described the various traditions in India as Vaishnavism, Shaivism, Tantra, and so on, instead of describing them as Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. In my presentation today, however, I will stick with the fourfold typology of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism to avoid too much novelty in my presentation. The third point is that this paper has two distinct parts. In the first part, I will try to present the Indic religious tradition as a single unit in such terms as its name, its history, its scriptures, its deities, its ethics, its values, its sociology, even its physiology, and so on. This is how an entry in an encyclopedia under the title, The Indic Religious Tradition in the Singular, might look like. In the second part, I shall try to demonstrate the insights which one might gain by carrying out such an exercise. One of the first issues one needs to take up is the name by which the Indic religious tradition should be called. There are many obvious candidates for this honor. One candidate is the term Indic religious tradition itself, perhaps in its translation as Bharat Mulak Dharma Parampara. To some of us, however, this might sound a bit mouthful and even artificial. Another candidate is the word Sanatana. This word has been used in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism by these traditions to refer to themselves. And it is echoed in the Sikh greeting, Sat Shri Akal. Truth is timeless. One possible disadvantage, however, of using the word Sanatana is that it has come to be associated with the Hindu religious tradition as a whole, and sometimes even with a narrower sliver of meaning within it when it is used to contrast the attitude of some Hindus to the Arya Samaj movement, as Sanatanis versus Arya Samaj. One could also use the word dharma for all the traditions. The difficulty, however, which this presents is that the word dharma has come to be used now in Indian languages as a synonym for the English word religion itself. A less obvious but interesting term would be Om Dharma. The sound symbol Om is closely associated with Hinduism, as in Om Tat Sat. It is also associated with Mahayana Buddhism, as in Om Mani Padme Hum. It is also accepted in Jainism, where it is used to refer to 5 holy beings within Jainism: the Arhat, the Siddh, the Acharya, the Upadhyaya, and the Muni. Repetition of Om thus becomes a legitimate practice for the Jain, serving to remind him of the 5 holy beings of his creeds, as Professor Padmanabh Jaini points out. The role of Om in Sikhism hardly calls for any elaboration. Ek Omkar is right there in the Mool Mantra. The disadvantage, however, of the suggestion is that Theravada Buddhism does not seem to recognize Om, to my considerable surprise and to the best of my knowledge. All these terms, therefore, have their advantages and disadvantages. One is also tempted to suggest a new term, namely Moksha Dharma. The word is not new. It is actually the title of a chapter in the Mahabharata, Moksha Dharma. It is, however, or rather, it has, however, the merit of appearing traditional, but recognizing that moksha as a concept is shared by all the religions of Indian origin. Therefore, it could be quite appropriate in our context. The next item we will need to turn to after the name of the tradition would be its history. The This need, however, need not detain us here, for this history has been discussed in some detail in the previous lectures. It will briefly be the history of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism as it unfolds on the Indian subcontinent and even beyond. Another item we need to examine is that of the scriptures of the tradition. These scriptures would naturally include the scriptures of the Hindu tradition, known as Shruti and Smriti, the scriptures of Buddhism, as found in the Theravada and Mahayana forms of it, the scriptures of Jainism, of its Digambara and Shvetambara traditions, and especially the Tattvadikam Sutra of Umaswati, which is accepted by both the sects in common. And of course, the Guru Granth Sahib of the Sikhs. It may not be out of place to suggest that the word Veda could be used to cover all these texts. This might sound a bit arbitrary, but the fact remains that the Hindu texts have been called the Vedas of the Brahmanas, and the Buddhist texts have been called the Vedas of the Shramanas. Similarly, the Guru Granth Sahib has been called the Sikh Veda. According to some scholars, the Rig Veda may even have served as a template for the Guru Granth Sahib. Similarly, the sacred books of the Sri Vaishnavas are known as the Tamil Veda. Keshav Chandra Sen even speaks of the Jivan Veda, Veda of life. This should not surprise us, for the Vedas themselves declare Ananta Vai Veda, Taittiriya Brahmana Kata. The Vedas are endless. This attitude is also reflected in the Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas, Hari Ananta, Hari Katha Ananta, Kahain Sunahi, Bahuvid Sab Satta. There is also the Buddhist saying, whatever is Buddha said is well said. Therefore, whatever is well said is Buddha said. There is evidence from medieval India that the word Veda was sometimes used by Indic scholars to refer even to the revealed texts of religions which did not originate in India, such as Islam. Let us now refer to the deities of the Indic religious tradition. Most of us here would be familiar with the gods of the so-called Hindu Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. These gods figure in various ways in all the four religions of Indian origin. In fact, in Buddhism, it is Lord Brahma who invites the Buddha after his realization to go forth and share his wisdom with the people. The gods of the Hindu Trinity, however, are also subjected to criticism within Buddhism and Jainism, wherein they are accorded a status somewhat beneath the holy figures of their own religions. This, however, also happens on a sectarian basis within the Hindu tradition. Ram and Krishna are very popular figures within Hinduism. We also find an echo, or we also find their echo in other religions of Indian origin. There is a Jataka story according to which the Buddha was born as Ram in a previous incarnation. Jainism alters the Ramayana story to suit its doctrines. In the Jain version, Ram does not kill Ravana, as that would not befit a Jain hero, a tradition committed to ahimsa. The killing is done by Lakshmana. The words Ram and Krishna appear numerous times in the Guru Granth Sahib. Ram appears more than 2,500 times. And while Krishna appears only 7 times, but other words for Krishna, such as Hari, appear no less than 8,344 times, and the word Govind 475 times. According to the Jain tradition, the Jain Tirthankara Arishtanemi was a cousin of Krishna. So there is a family relationship also. quite literally among the religions. The Ram story is especially cherished within the Sikh tradition, wherein the following statement is attributed to Guru Gobind Singh: Ram Katha Jug Juga Atal. We turn next to the ethics of Indic religions. Each of the four religions of Indian origin, which comprise the Indic religious tradition, have their own specific rites and rituals that vary among themselves. However, this must not obscure the fact that all of them subscribe to certain basic ethical propositions. Perhaps the best way to develop this point is to recognize the distinction between what are called Vishesh or Prithak dharmas or duties and what are called Sadharan or Samanya dharmas or duties. The first category of dharmas or duties refers to the specific duty of a class or tradition or sect, which is incumbent upon those who belong to it. While the second set of duties applies to all human beings, irrespective of their class, caste, or faith. The following four Sadharana dharmas seem to find a place in all the four religions of Indian origin. 1. Abstention from taking life. 2. Abstention from telling lies. 3. Abstention from stealing. And 4. Abstention from improper sexual conduct. We turn next to the values or axiology of the Indic religious tradition. The values of the Indic religious tradition can be presented in terms of the four values of dharma, artha, kam, and moksha. These values aim to secure the best for a human being, both in this world and the next. And this general aspiration is shared by all the four religions of Indian origin. Hinduism openly advocates the cultivation of the good life, both for this world and the next. Buddhism and Jainism, despite their more pronounced monastic orientation, seek the best for their lay followers. And Sikhism, despite its pronounced commitment to life in the world, does not ignore the spiritual dimension of life. The Guru Granth Sahib seeks the best in this world and the next in the following remarkable phrase: "Ye lok sukhi, par lok suhele." It is, however, true that the various traditions could be distinguished in terms of the relative weight they attach to these four values. One could also identify changes within each tradition in terms of the relative weight attached to these core values in the course of their history. One could turn next to the sociology of the Indic religious tradition. I would, however, not say much on this point because an entire lecture was devoted to the role of Varna and Ashrama in the Indic religious tradition in this series. What I would like to do, however, is to address the question of the position of women within the Indic religious tradition. It is true that the monastic elements in these religions tend to view women in general with disfavor. Sikhism provides an interesting exception by giving women a role, positive role in its martial tradition. Nevertheless, all the four religions have been criticized on the basis of the actual position of women in these traditions, which often contrasts with the more idealistic formulation of their position within these traditions themselves. One interesting aspect of the position of women in all these four traditions consists of the difference in tone when these religions speak of womankind in general and when they speak of her in a specific role as mother, sister, daughter, and wife. I found this most remarkable, this difference in attitude. We can also turn next to the physiology, even the physiology of the Indic religious tradition. It is well known that the phenomenon of sleep is dealt with philosophically in a very different way than is usual in Advaita Vedanta. Normally, we think that sleep involves the absence of consciousness. Advaita Vedanta thinks that it involves the absence of everything else other than consciousness. Sometimes breathing is especially focused on in yoga as one of the 8 limbs. According to yoga, breathing ceases in the highest state of meditation. And the only sign of life which the adept in yoga is left with in the highest state is body warmth. In Buddhism, the cause of our involvement in the world is identified as trishna, or thirst. We are reborn because we have a thirst, we long for being. In Jainism, hunger plays a major role in the sense that the ideal way of dying, according to Jainism, is by fasting to death. In Sikhism, a human being is advised when confronted with the fight or flight response to respond with fight. I have so far attempted to present what an outline of the Indic religious tradition would look like if it were presented in terms of its name, its history, its scriptures, and so on. I hope this has been an interesting exercise. Nevertheless, it is difficult to avoid the impression that it is a kind of cut and paste job, although useful at this stage in our inquiry. In the second part of this paper, I would now like to move beyond this and try to indicate how some insights into the religious life of this subcontinent are organically advanced when we take all these 4 traditions, or as many of them as we need, simultaneously into account. I would like to move towards demonstrating how this happens with the help of 2 distinct points. My first point follows from my previous lecture on Hinduism and Buddhism, wherein we discussed how these 2 traditions might be dealing with the same reality despite their different metaphysical orientation. I would like to take my cue on this point from a well-known Indian philosopher, Ramchandra Gandhi, who also happens to be the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. He once declared, I think prophetically, that the metaphysical reconciliation of Hinduism and Buddhism is the great unfinished task of Indian philosophy. So let me see how this might be attempted. Several years ago, I attended a conference in Hawaii, where the question was broached by Professor Fritz Stahl, very well-known figure in Indology. He recounted that while teaching Indian philosophy, he described the concept of Brahman to the class as something which was without differentiation, internal or external, or technically what is called the absence of Sajatiya Bhed, Vijatiya Bhed, and Swagat Bhed. Thereupon, okay, I beg your pardon. Then when he came to Buddhism, he described the concept of shunyata, or emptiness, which again was empty of all restrictions and differentiations. Thereupon, he told us, a Chinese student asked him the following question. If Brahman could not be differentiated from anything, and neither could shunyata, how could then they be differentiated from each other? Therefore, the two must be the same. Professor Stoll complimented the students and concurred with him. So the resolution here is that they are dealing with the same reality. And now I'm going to question this. Professor Stoll's position, if correct, if it is correct, will obviously reconcile the metaphysical issue between Hinduism and Buddhism. Much as I was attracted to this proposition, I still somehow felt that it was too good to be true, despite the fact that the Maitreya Upanishad refers to the ultimate reality as both Brahman and Shunya. It took some time to dawn on me that if two things are indistinguishable, it does not follow that they are identical. That if two things are indistinguishable, it does not follow that they are identical. What he said was that they are indistinguishable. The Chinese. For instance, physiologists have pointed out that when two individuals look at an object which is red in color, the red color which they perceive is not identical. However, the difference between one individual's perception and another is so subtle that they can, so far, not calibrate it. Which means that their perception is indistinguishable, but not identical. I would therefore like to propose a slightly different model for the metaphysical reconciliation of Hindu and Buddhist thought. I've already hinted at it in an earlier lecture by discussing the question of the nature of light in modern physics, namely whether it is a wave or a particle. It was then pointed out that one way of reconciling these two aspects would be to recognize that some aspects of the behavior of light are best explained on the assumption that it is a particle. I am told that a photon hits an object, particles are released in the object. So it's behaving like a particle. And other aspects of the behavior of light are best explained on the assumption that it is a wave, as when it spreads. Similarly, the concept of Brahman assumes that it is a permanent entity, Vikal, Abadit. And the concept of Shunya argues that there is no such permanence underlying anything. We begin by realizing that both these positions are conceptual formulations, and therefore it could well be that some aspects of the ultimate reality are best understood when it is treated as permanent. And other aspects of the same ultimate reality are best understood by treating that it is not so. Perhaps an analogy would be helpful at this stage. Let us imagine that we are watching the TV screen on which we see many images appear and disappear. We could then choose to describe the images as being transient, as lacking in permanence. However, if we choose to include the screen, without which the images could not exist, then we would have to say that the images are transient, but the screen is permanent. In other words, the difference is not in the nature of the reality which we are discussing, but in the manner in which we choose to describe it, with whatever purpose we have in mind. So if we look only at the images, we will see Nairatmya. But the moment we factor in the screen, it becomes Jivatma. Okay, move on. The right point to pause, I think. I now move to the second point. In order to introduce the second point, I would like to begin by citing a hymn from perhaps the oldest piece of literature so far available to us in India. This text is none other than the Rig Veda, the 129th hymn of the 10th mandala, or book of the Rig Veda, is often described as the hymn of creation. It is a famous piece of literature which has appealed even to such secular minds as Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and Shashi Tharoor. It has been translated into English by several people, but I still prefer the translation by Arthur MacDonald, although it was made in the 19th century. So if you will indulge me, I will quote the first and the last verses from this hymn. The first verse. It is also known as the Nasadiya hymn. Nasadasi, Nasadasi. Non-being then existed not, nor being. There was no air, nor sky that is beyond it. What was concealed, wherein, in whose protection? And was there deep, unfathomable water? This is the first one. The last, none knowest whence creation has arisen, and whether he has or has not produced it. He who surveys it in the highest heaven, he only knows, or perhaps he may know not. It's a splendid hymn of 7 stanzas. And there's a danger of being distracted by it, by its splendor, from our purpose. Our purpose is served by looking at the first line closely. There was neither being nor non-being. The first line, epistemologically, presents two options: as something is or is not. Neither being nor non-being. This provides us with the fundamental principle of Western epistemology, that something either is or is not. I think technically known as the excluded middle of Aristotelian logic, which is the basis of Western logic. If, however, we look at the first line more closely, we discover that it reveals three options and not just two. The third option is that something can be is and not. There was neither being nor non-being. So there can be being, there can be non-being, there can be neither being nor non-being. We now move to Buddhism. Buddhism contains a series of unexplained or unanswered questions by the Buddha. These are simply the questions which the Buddha refused to answer. One of them happens to be the question, what happens to the enlightened being, the Arhat, the Buddha, after he or she dies? Now, Buddha said that this question cannot be answered through either of the four categories. He makes them four. Is not, neither is nor is not, both is and is not. Yeah, we'll discuss this in a minute. It is interesting to see how the Buddha responds when the question is put to him. When the question is put to him by Vajgota, the Buddha says that the question does not fit the case. So I will summarize what the Buddha says. You spend a night in the jungle and you raise a fire because cold. In the morning, you put the fire out. Now I ask you the question, where has the fire gone? To the east, to the west, to the north, or to the south? So poor Vajgota says, nowhere. The question does not fit the case. The question is also then put to him by Valunkyaputta. And in this case, the Buddha says, suppose someone was going through a forest and was hit by an arrow, and a surgeon was brought to remove it. But just as the surgeon was about to remove it, the person were to ask him to stop and say, I do not want the arrow removed until I know the personal details about the person who shot the arrow, the wood from which the arrow was made, and so on. The person would die before such information could be obtained. The message was that such questions are of little use in advancing one towards enlightenment. And therefore the Buddha would refuse to answer. But please note that he ruled out all the four possibilities. Does a person continue to exist after death? Does such a person not exist after death? Does such a person neither exist nor not exist after death? And does such a person both exist and not exist after death? Now we may think that this is getting a bit too abstruse, but let us take a question for consideration like, is the universe finite or infinite? Now, one could say the universe is finite in the sense that some aspects of it are finite. One could say that it is infinite in the sense that some aspects of it are infinite. One can say that it is both finite and infinite in the sense that some aspects of it are finite, some are infinite. This leaves one option. But what about the option that it is neither finite nor infinite? This would be the case if the universe was treated as unreal. If we now turn to Jainism, we find that Jainism contains the doctrine of Syadvad, or the doctrine of conditioned postulation. This doctrine provides us with 7 options. Some things is not, is and is not successively, is and is not simultaneously, and hence inexpressible. Fifth, is and is inexpressible, is not and is inexpressible. And finally, is not, and is inexpressible. Again, we are already on the brink of the abyss, right? What is all this? Let us try to make sense of what the Jains might be telling us. Let us take the case of this room, which we will try to describe in terms of heat or cold. To a person who is coming from a warmer place, the room would be cold. To a person coming from a cooler place, the room would be warm. Thus, the room could be both cold and warm. It could be warm, it could be cold, it could be both cold and warm. But to describe the same place at the same time makes it inexpressible. This might sound like a cop-out, but consider this. A room will have a certain temperature, like this room now. And that temperature is inexpressible in terms of cold or warmth. The temperature might be cold for some, warm for others. It is a neutral statement, the temperature of the room. It is our experience of it which we are giving a value of cold. The temperature is a fact. Coldness and warmth are values we attach to it in the light of our experience. This gives us the last three options. The room can be said to be cold and inexpressible as having a certain temperature. Could said to be not cold or warm and inexpressible as having a certain temperature, and both cold and warm and inexpressible as having a certain temperature. If we only studied Hinduism by itself, Buddhism by itself, and Jainism by itself, then we might miss the larger picture which emerges when we look upon them as parts of a composite tradition. This epistemological option, this is what we discover, that the epistemological options undergo a progressive extension in the history of Indian philosophy. The time might have come to bring matters to the conclusion. In the first part of this paper, we took tentative steps towards profiling the Indic religious tradition as a single entity. In the second part, we tried to provide a justification for developing such an approach by indicating how our philosophical horizon was enlarged and deepened by taking a synoptic view of the entire tradition instead of treating it in silos like Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and so on. In the first example, we discovered how our philosophical understanding was enriched ontologically, the nature of being. And in the second, we discovered how it was enriched epistemologically, how we'd come to know about that being. As I conclude, however, I would like to descend from the philosophical heights to the normal plane of existence. It would be a mistake to think that we can only philosophically benefit from treating the Indic religious tradition as a whole. And I would like to argue as I conclude that this could happen existentially. For instance, we could conclude after taking a synoptic view that all of us, each one of us, should be born a Hindu, be compassionate like a Buddhist, fight like a Sikh, and die like a Jain. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sharma, for giving us a detour of Indic religions, philosophical traditions, and ontological and epistemological complexities. But I think the point that we should treat the four of them as one. And think, and not in silos. And they probably complement each other. I think that's the message that has come out both in this talk and in your earlier talks also. And the second point, I think, which I could follow was that there is no one absolute truth or description. And what you mentioned, how you think can be described or not described, or described and not described, 7 different ways in Jainism, that itself is a revolution. So thank you very much, and now I request
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. I'm not a scholar like you, but I'm agitated and think about all this very deeply. So I would like to present the Indic religions, not on a standalone basis as you have tried to do, but in the context of what are called religions, because we are trying to understand the Indic traditions through the definition of religions, which have been formulated elsewhere, shaped elsewhere, and brought into our discourse. And we are finding it difficult to fathom what is our religion. In fact, this is a subject on which I have done some study from the perspective of geopolitics and sociology, that ours is a philosophy. Whether it is, you take anything, for example, if you take the idea of Hinduism, it is 6 darshanas. And out of which 3 do not even talk about God. They talk about only Atman. So they are called Nirishwara. The common point between all the 6 darshanas is that they all accept the idea of dharma. Because non-believing in God is not atheism. Not believing dharma is atheism. So there is a huge difference between how you assess the Indian traditions. It's not just 3 or 4 or 5, any number of traditions. All of them ultimately owe their loyalty to the idea of dharma. So it is philosophy. What is philosophy? And what is ideology? Philosophy is that where you think that this is your thought, but the other man has another thought. Maybe you are right. I feel I am right. Maybe you are also right. Let us have a dialogue. So we resolve the entire, at least attempted to resolve the dispute through the tradition of Tarka Shastra that avoided street battles and wars in India. All the religious wars were avoided. See, you talked about 4 traditions, but there were no 4 armies. There was no jihad. There was no crusade. Why? We were also very passionate believers in what we were saying and doing, because we never tried to force our views on another. That is the greatest aspect of the Indian tradition, that we never tried to force our views on another. And the medium that we had was the Tarka Shastra. The greatest Tarka that took place was between Adi Shankara and Mandana Mishra, where an householder had a dialogue with a sannyasi, and the test was, if the householder lost, he should become a sannyasi. And if the sannyasi lost, he should become a householder. And the person who was the umpire was the householder's wife. This kind of dialogue took place. And the result of it. And she didn't want to be the umpire. She put a garland around Mandana Mishra and Adi Shankara and said, this fresh garland, any man on whom the garland loses its freshness has lost, because he got angry. So anger was supposed to be the sign of defeat. The extent to which we had taken the subtlety of the debate that avoided all religious wars. Even Ashoka's war was not a religious war. He became religious after the war. The entire Indian tradition of war was intended to avoid wars. Even in the war, there are detailed rules as to who should fight with who and how an adharmic war is worse than defeat. You know, these were all the great disciplines that had been integrated into Indian tradition, which is completely absent in the religious ideologies outside. In fact, I first heard the distinction between philosophy and ideology from a person in whose name you will never associate with this, is Bill Clinton. He spoke in 2007 in a meeting that there is a huge difference between philosophy and ideology. Ideology means that I am right, you are wrong. Philosophy means I am right, maybe you are also right. The world is moving from philosophy to ideology. It's a great danger for world peace. From then onwards, I began doing the comparative study of the Indic religious traditions. I would never call them religion. Indic traditions. And so, first we avoided war. And that is why there is no terror. Some people try to even impute Hindu terror in 2009. I had the opportunity of studying those cases and briefing lawyers and how fake those cases were. So, the idea of religion outside India, if it is to be incorporated into the Indian discourse, we will never be able to understand what is our philosophy of religions. Second is on women. See, the broad understanding is that women did not have their proper position in the Indian tradition. I will here quote an article written by Dr. Fatima Hussain in Daily Times in Pakistan. She is a professor. She was a professor in Delhi University. She wrote an article in Daily Times in Pakistan in 2012, August 11. I'm quoting her. The position of women in a society is the true index of its cultural and spiritual attainment. In Rigvedic age, women enjoyed a high position in the Indian society. They had full freedom and spiritual and intellectual development. Gargi Vachaspati was one such a distinguished woman of the such era. Vedic literature has references which recommend assurances of the birth of a scholarly daughter. Daughters, like sons, were initiated into Vedic studies and had to lead a life devoted to learning self-control and discipline. Many women rose to become Vedic scholars, orators, poets, and teachers. This was the position. There is a large body of studies that shows the position of a woman in the society is decided by the security conditions of the society. If the society becomes insecure, the first victim is the woman's rights. In a society where there is complete security, women enjoy complete freedom. That is what the Vedas say. So when our security became threatened, for whatever reason, internal or external, that affected the women's rights. In fact, Stephanie Tavalama, one of the women rights and who are called feminists, she had a beautiful observation to make about India. She said, in the entire West, she speaks about women's rights and all that. Women got voting rights only in 1924, 25. In Switzerland, women got voting rights in 1971. Why? Because the religion said women were not human beings. In fact, for the church to recognize that women are human beings, it took 7th century. So they were not regarded as human beings. And that came into sociology, and that came into constitution, and that came into electoral politics. But in India, they never had any issue. I think in Baroda, they had voting rights well before the British were granted voting rights. British women got voting rights. Why in India there was no objection? Stefani Tavalama says the Indian mind is basically feminine in character. And she gives beautiful example. I will read it out because she is one of the most well-recognized women rights activists. While in the West, women being regarded as a weaker sex, not associated with power. While in India, women were regarded as power, Shakti, with Durga, Lakshmi, Saraswati, as women goddesses representing strength, wealth, and knowledge. Indira Gandhi was hailed as Durga after she won the 1971 war. Jayalalitha was depicted as Mahishasura Mardani. Tavalama said, Indian freedom movement was fought in the name of a woman. There's a huge difference. There's a paradigm. The Indic traditions were basically feminine in character because the origin of the universe itself is because of the feminine force. This is what Rigveda says. In Devi Shuktam hymn of Rigveda, it declares feminine energy as the essence of the universe, the one who creates all matter and consciousness, the eternal and infinite, the metaphysical and empirical reality, and the soul of everything. So, feminine force, it is the kinetic force of what is called the Shiva, and this is in the earliest literature of the Indian civilization. So, on women, everywhere practice it differs from principles. It's because the practice is conditioned by contemporary situation. Principles are enunciated when times are peaceful. And so to say the Indian traditions denied women their due position is not the correct understanding of the Indian civilization. It requires much more work. And even Stefani Tavalama, a critic of all traditions, recognizes that in the Indian traditions, women came up, could come up. Even today in America, no woman can get elected. But in India, Sucheta Kripalani became the chief minister of UP when the literacy rate of women in UP was less than 20%. Indira Gandhi became the Prime Minister of India when the literacy rate of women were less than 25%. Who objected to their becoming Prime Minister or Chief Minister? Because they were women. Why we cannot understand that the basic Indian psyche is different from the West even today, the most advanced West. Now I am going into a very important part of, there is a paradox of declining female happiness. This was done by two great women economists, Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers. It is in the National Bureau of Economic Research. It was published in 2009. And it says, by many objective measures, the lives of women in the United States have improved over the last 35 years. In education, in commerce, in corporate management, in profession, in politics, everywhere their position is gone. Yet we means the two researchers, show that the measures of subjective well-being indicate that women's happiness has declined both in absolute and relative terms. By getting them into positions alone, you are not celebrating women. You are arithmetically equating women, but there is a woman psyche. And that cannot be handled only by positioning women materially. They are much more subtle. They are much more nobler. They are the sources of creation. Without them, there can be no extension of the human society. It requires a different approach. So what these two economists say is that the paradox of women's declining relative well-being is found across all data sets measures of subjective well-being and is pervasive across democratic groups and industrialized societies. It is both America and Europe. Relative declines in female happiness have eroded a gender gap in happiness, in which women in the 1970s typically reported higher subjective well-being than did men. 1970s. These declines have continued, and a new gender gap is arising, one with higher subjective well-being of men. This is a research by the National Bureau of Economic Research conducted by two great economists. What I'm saying is that we don't go in depth to understand, and we are carried away by the narratives and discourses based on the logic and experience and the terminologies of the West. Like, dharma being equated to religion is one of the greatest distortions of both religion and dharma. But we are struggling with it, we are explaining it. So in a language in which we can never explain our tradition, we are trying to explain our tradition. That is the reason why our own, particularly the English educated Indians, confusion about what is Indian Indic traditions is, this confusion is because of it. Finally, you touched on the subject of universe, whether it is finite or infinite. I have to now get into the idea of what you call as religion, which we call as philosophy, and science. Till the quantum theories came, everything that was seen was called universe. It must be material. It must be seen, felt. So the Newtonian formulation of universe completely changed when the relativity theory came, and everything is atom, which you cannot see. So the unseen is the reality. This was the quantum mechanics. But how did that unseen atom come? What is the process? That is, atom is the fundamental matter. How did it come into being? On that, there was huge problem. In fact, even at that time, the Big Bang theory was being discussed, but Einstein rejected it. But Big Bang theory is almost established with Stephen Hawking formulating a mathematical model to prove that Big Bang did happen. 1/1,000,000th of an atom developed such heat that it exploded. But he said, don't ask me how that 1/1,000,000th of an atom came into being. How that matter came into being, which produced this huge appearance. Don't ask. This was Stephen Hawking, but nobody created it, and so there is no God. In 2020, the person who worked with Stephen Hawking is Roger Penrose. He has got Nobel Prize. For what? There was a pre-existing consciousness prior to matter, which resulted in matter. So this completely goes in line with at least 7-8 Nobel laureates who said, if you want to find an answer to the problems of creation which quantum mechanics has posed, you have to look at the Vedas and Upanishads. So Vedas and Upanishads were not shoutings and your phonetic variations. They contain some scientific truth. This is what the scientists said. I have not come across any university. I was lecturing it in the IIT Bombay a couple of weeks back. When I was saying all this, all the scientists and scholars were looking absolutely aghast because none of them knew that there is an alignment taking place between Indian philosophy and post-quantum science. In fact, Roger Penrose's theory, I should read out how it is. He says, consciousness is beyond computable physics. It cannot be turned into a formula. There is no calculation. So when we are talking about Indian tradition, we should know that we are moving high above the contemporary understanding of knowledge. So the idea of science is somewhere in the horizon, as 8 Nobel laureates have said, that we have to find answers for modern science only in Vedas and Upanishads, which is something the Indian science student is not aware. The Vedic experts are not aware. The leaders of the country are not aware. The media is not aware. I can tell you, this country is steeped in illiteracy. So when we are discussing about Indic tradition, we are talking about it only from the point of view of the person practicing. But the persons who have formulated it were great rishis. And they have perceived it in a manner that they were not simply poets. They had a higher perception. They could go far, far, far beyond what the senses could do. And their consciousness was raised to such a level, they could identify with higher universal consciousness and point to the origin of the universe itself. And so I think we have got to explain to the modern mind, the youngsters, as India is rising. India is no more a country to be written off. It has its own place in the world today, and the world is looking at India. There is a dead end in the world. All the ideologies and the developments of the last 100, 150 years have created a challenging situation and a crisis. There doesn't seem to be any answer within the 4 corners of modernity. Fortunately, India is still not a modern society. It is deeply rooted in tradition. And so we can handle modernity through tradition, with tradition, and at the same time understand modernity without being absorbed by it. So this is what the world needs. I think that more work has to be done. I would appeal to Dr. Sharma, who is so deeply rooted in the in-depth study of the Indian traditions, to come out with how the modern science and the principles that you have been expounding, particularly on the last point, whether it is finite or infinite. Isavasyamidam sarvam yatkinjat jagatyam jagatyana tikhyena punjidaha magrida kasyasiddhan. Because I have also studied it from the economic perspective. Mahatma Gandhi said, if the Hindus lost all their literature and had only this particular verse, they would be able to rule the world. Because the entire thing is a manifestation of one force. You must take only as little as you need from it, so that it is available to others. This is the entire understanding of creation, environmental, ecological, economic principles. So we have to do more work. And I'm very happy that I could get an opportunity to link what I wanted to say with what Dr. Sharma said. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think that was a fitting addition to what Professor Sharma said, and the relevance of the Vedic thinking about the nature of the universe itself. And essentially the science, Roger Penrose wrote this book some years ago. It's called The Emperor's, what is it called? Emperor's New Mind, in which he looked at this issue of consciousness. And he went into this, the fault line in the modern science, and which is what he referred to as, whether it is duality, the wave or particle. So you said that they complement each other. Sometimes you use this, sometimes you use that. But this big debate between Einstein and the theory of gravity, which is very different from quantum, and both are very powerful, and yet they don't see eye to eye with each other. So unless that is reconciled, and that can only be reconciled by referring to the consciousness and by referring to this experience, etc. An idea which I think we must be grateful to people like Fritjof Capra, who way back in the 70s brought this, that what is quantum, modern physics at that time was saying, is very similar to what had been talked about the rishis and the sages, etc. But again, we are still referring to them, but no Indian research or thinking on this. And I think one impediment is that there is no knowledge of Sanskrit, which is where first you have to, because you are based on relying on translations. So I think it's been very useful and intellectually stimulating discussion. So I'll now open this for any questions and answers or comments. Yeah, there. Please introduce yourself.
Good evening, sir. My name is Akash. I am a research scholar of geopolitics of technology.